Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Dylan Schroeder. I'm a librarian on the arts and culture team here at the Vancouver Public Library, and I will be your host this evening. My colleague Candy is also working on this event, and they will be in the background making sure that everything runs smoothly. So please say hi to Candy in the chat. Just a reminder that this is a webinar tonight, so we've got the Q&A function there at the bottom as well as the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I am a settler in these lands, which means that I feel a responsibility to continually learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in the place I call home, and to take a sincere action toward decolonization, especially in my work as a public servant. If you're joining us from another part of the country or another part of the world, there's a great resource that Candy will share in the chat so that you can learn about the land where you live. Tonight is very exciting because through the magic of webinar, we're having a bit of a cross-country, slightly international conversation. We're going to hear an author from Souk, BC, interviewing a writer based in Edmonton about a book that explores an important and overlooked part of Canadian history, particularly that of the Inuit peoples of the Canadian North. The book is Kinauvit, What's Your Name?, which is an incredible book. I've been reading through it. It's so well written and so fascinating. And I recommend that everyone go get a copy from your favorite local bookstore. And if you didn't hear, just this morning, it was revealed to be a shortlist nominee for the Writers' Trust Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing, which is incredibly exciting. So let's get into it. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker and author, Norma. Darrel, could you please join me on stage? Hello, welcome. Dr. Norma Dunning is an Inuk writer as well as scholar, researcher, professor, and grandmother. Her short story collection, Taina, won the 2021 Governor General's Award for Literature, and her previous short story collection, Animuktuk and Other Stories, received the Danuta Gleed Literary Award, the Howard O'Hagan Award for Short Stories, and the Bronze Forward Indies Award for Short Stories. She lives in Edmonton, Alberta, and it's wonderful to have you with us tonight, Norma. And also with us, we have Darrel McLeod. He's the author of Peacow and Mama Scotch, which received the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction, 2 Governor General's Literary Awards tonight with us. He's Cree from Territory 8 in Northern Alberta. Before deciding to pursue writing in his retirement, McLeod was a chief negotiator of land claims for the federal government and executive director of education and international affairs with the Assembly of First Nations. He holds degrees in French literature and education from the University of British Columbia, and he lives in Souk, British Columbia. And we are so excited, Darrel, that you're here with us as well. They're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they'll take questions from the audience. So for the audience, I want to ask you to please use the Q&A button to submit questions instead of the chat. It just makes it easier for us to manage them, and then your questions won't get buried in the chat. But if you don't like using the Q&A and aren't sure how to use it and prefer putting things in the chat, that's too. And on that note, let's just make sure that everything we've got in the chat is civil and respectful. And with that, let's take things away. Darrel, go ahead.
Hi, Kinauvit, Dylan. It's wonderful to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation with my friend Norma. And I'm just dazzled by the amazing success and notoriety you're getting for your work, your body of work. And today, as Dylan said, the news was announced that you're a finalist, one of only five finalists for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for nonfiction or political writing with the Writers' Trust. That's just fabulous. So congratulations.
Thank you, Darrel. It's quite a surprise. I did not even know that my book had been entered, so it was a complete surprise. It's wonderful.
Nice. Well, just a heads up, Norma and friends, that I'm joining from Mexico, so there is a bit of an international element to our conversation. And just warning you, because there may be the occasional sound effect in the background, dogs barking, vendors going by with loudspeakers on, trying to sell baked goods, etc. But it's all part of the experience. So Norma, can you just tell us a little bit about I mean, I'd love to, we don't have a lot of time, but I'd love to hear about your body of work, because it is developing into that, isn't it? How many books do you, I mean, I've read your poetry, I've read your short stories, you have a novel, now you have a nonfiction, and you're getting this wonderful and well-deserved, might I add, notoriety. And I'm absolutely thrilled for you. But can you just tell us a little bit about, I mean, quickly about your body of work? I'd love everybody to know about that. It isn't just this book. There's a lot more.
Yeah. Well, the thing that happened with the last two books was COVID. And
Yes.
yes, and so here I am holding up my books.
All right. Your
Kinauvit,
babies.
like Kinauvit and Akia, they published like a month away from one another. And
Wow.
and it was based on the printing shops having to shut down, and then finally they open, and then there's a paper shortage and everything shuts down. And then they can get going, and boy, and then both of them came out. They were scheduled to be about a year apart, but everything just like went through all at once. So now I have two collections of poetry, two collections of short stories, the nonfiction, Kinauvit, and I'm writing, Darrel, I've never written a novel. So then I thought, why write only one? Write two. So I'm writing two. I have no idea.
Beautiful.
I have no idea when everything will finish up, but it's really been wonderful, and I've really been well received. People have been very kind and generous towards my work, and I'm grateful. I'm very grateful.
Wonderful. So let's bring the focus now to the book, your nonfiction work that for which you just became a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize. And I'll let you say the title because I want to hear it pronounced properly. And maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write. I mean, I have my ideas, of course, of what would have motivated you, having read the book twice. But maybe you can tell us what your motivation was for writing your book.
Kinauvit.
The title first. Beautiful title.
It's just Kinauvit, and that means
Kinauvit. Okay.
And it started out as a thesis for my master's of arts degree in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. But I mean, that's when the writing started. But all of the research and all of that started when I made application as to be included in the Nunavut Lands Claim Agreement.
Yes.
Myself and my three sons, and that was in around 2001 when I put through that application. And you send everything off on the fax machine, and then a month goes by, and then 2 months go by, and now 3 months have gone by. And I phoned up to Kinauvit and asked for, just what was happening with the applications. And it was an Inuk government writer who said to me, well, what was your disc number? And I said, well, I never ever had one. Well, what was your mother's disc number? And I said, well, she never had one. And there's this kind of, like this kind of frustration where, and that worker follows it up by saying, if either of you had a number, it would be quicker to process this paperwork.
Norma, I'm just going to interrupt for a minute. I mean, a lot of people won't know what you mean by a disc. I mean, I know because I've read the book, and I encourage everybody to buy your book and learn about the disc system, which I was shocked to learn came in late in the day. And I mean, Canadian history. I mean, the Indian Act came in the 1800s and all its various amendments and all the things that so many people know. But the disc system didn't come into place like until 1940s, 1945, I think it was, right? You would have thought that Canada might have been a little bit more progressive by then. So tell us about the disc. What is this concept of a disc for Inuit identity?
Well, the concept lies in all of the non-Inuit northern administrators, missionary people, doctors, who were coming into the north, and there had been it's with the Supreme Court of Canada, there was a lawsuit that was put forward. Initially, there was an Inuk man was sent into Montreal from Nunavut,
Okay.
requiring treatment. And the province says to the federal government, the Quebec province says to the feds, who's taking care of this guy's medical expenses? And the feds say, you are. And the province of Quebec says, no, we're not, you are. And so there is this confusion about, what do we do with these Inuit people? And it becomes a Supreme Court of Canada case that is titled Eskimo are Eskimos Indians. And that is the exact title. And you can look it up online. It is on the Supreme Court of Canada website.
Just rips my heart out to hear that
I
the title
know,
of that case.
like what accumulates is Diamond Jeunesse, who was an anthropologist out of New Zealand. He comes into the courtroom and he has First Nation skulls, First Nation clothing, tools, and food on one side of a table. And on the other side, he has Inuit skulls, Inuit clothing, food, and tools. And
Wow.
what he is trying to demonstrate is that these two groups are not the same. They are not the same. And as things go along, Auguste Desilets is the lawyer for the feds. He's representing the feds, and he has this grand summation whereby he says, oh no, Eskimos are just like Indians. They have the same inability to create agriculture or industry. They have no understanding of money or how it works. And then he says, they have the same, he makes it sound like it's like a word laziness, but it's much more legal than that. But he ends it all by saying, these two groups have the same unhygienic mode of existence. And that lays in our Supreme Court of Canada. Those words are laying there. What happens is now the federal government has to take responsibility for the healthcare of Inuit Canadians. So they go off first they map out the entire North. And they use the Hudson's Bay is like the middle point.
Okay.
So E numbers were issued for Inuit who lived on the eastern side of the bay, and W numbers were issued for Inuit on the western side of the bay. And what it all boiled down to is, this all happens as, also we have World War II kind of humming, we have that going on. Anyway, that it all turns, for the administrators that were coming in, they had a hard time pronouncing and spelling Inuit names. And so the records they felt were not being kept properly for medical care or school and what they really have to do is what the feds are what's happening is that they're being held accountable towards the Inuit population. And we were never invited or negotiated into treaty at all. Like we were just left up there. So everything in the North is based on land claims agreement. And but they're having this struggle with our names. And so they come up with this great idea. we will just issue these discs, and we see them here on the book jacket. This photograph is by an Inuk photographer, Barry Pottle.
Okay.
And he did a photographic installation of beautiful of discs that photographed from several people. So they issued these discs and they're numbered. And so that was their way of tracking Inuit. But what that disc, that the amount of information that could be gathered from that number indicated where you lived, what you traded. So actually your income when you're bringing fur into the post, for at spring. And the kids wore that number and were called out by that number in school. And you had to present that number if you were at the store to make a purchase. You had to present it if you went to the doctor. So it became a part of your everyday life,
And the physical disc, Norma, was meant to be worn around a person's neck or as a bracelet, or?
Initially, Inuit were told, because in Inuktitut that word would be oyami. So you had to have your necklace or your oyami on your person at all times. And so as time goes along, I mean, this becomes a 30-year block of time where within that 3 decades, Inuit traditional naming systems were interrupted. The ceremony of death, is interrupted. Inuit are eventually told, no more of these Inuit names. That's the end of it. You have to start naming your children biblical Christian names. And so for Inuit, the processes of a colonization occurred in our country much later, much faster. And so it goes in that, 3 decades of time. It's like all of this is heaped onto Inuit. And I always think that Inuit had a fear of non-Inuit administrators and medical doctors, teachers, and all of that. And they were told, you better toe the line, you better toe the line. And there were incidents of where a mother had lost all of her children's discs, their necklaces, their oyami. And she's terrified. And she's afraid that she's going to be put in jail. She's so fearful. And so you see how there's this interruption to ceremony, to drum dance, to coming together at spring feast and fall. And the times when Inuit just came together and visited and held the ceremony together. And all of that is being, they're all being told, if you do those practices, if you practice drum dance, you're going to jail. And people were fearful. So it becomes something that is very ingrained in Inuit daily life. And people will say, I never knew about this, but we're talking about a government-sponsored system that was never announced.
Right.
So when the disc system begins to shut down in around the 1970s, there's no announcement that it's shutting down either.
Right, of course.
Once the disc system closes, then Project Surname comes into the north, and now everyone had to get a last name. And once those lists go into Ottawa, it's recognized that people who live in the same household all had a different name. last name. And so then it becomes project correction, where the Inuit are told again, you all have to have the same last name when you live under one roof. And so it honestly, Darrel, it takes the government of Canada probably about the mid-90s, 1990s, before they have Inuit names and that population on record. So it's just and when I speak about this, a lot of people will say, well, nobody died. And I always think, what the marker, is that what we need? We need to have death to have this kind of colonial intrusion, that's when it really matters. But
well, Norma, on that note, I mean, perhaps nobody died from wearing a disc in itself,
right,
or from the assignment of a number. But that was just one symbolic part of the tragic assimilation. And you mentioned that it happened quickly. And, I like to say, when I speak about the assimilation and colonization of my people in Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta, I say it was rapid, brutal, and tragic. And I agree with you that from what I know about the colonization of Inuit people in Canada, it was more condensed. It happened in a shorter time frame, and it was equally as tragic, if not more tragic, with forced relocations. And I mean, I'm just baffled at the idea of a forced relocation in the type of landscape and habitat where the Inuit people lived. I mean, if you relocate somebody in where they know where they can hunt, they know where they can fish, they know how to survive, their ancestors have been there since time immemorial, and you relocate them, 1,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers to a completely unfamiliar landscape, what the hell are they going to do to survive?
That's right.
And that just baffled me. And it's a little known fact in Canada that happened. And there's so much about your book that is educational for, it should be recommended and mandatory reading for every Canadian. Certainly as an educator, I would say that it should be mandatory reading for all Canadians, and junior high school, and university, mandatory, not optional. And when I did, I had the good fortune of reading your book in its advanced stage and to write a blurb, but thank you for asking me. I was very honored. And, in my blurb, I compared your book to Chief Robert Joseph's book about the Indian Act. I think the title is 21 Things You Need to Know About the Indian Act, which has been a bestseller in Canada for years now. And I hope your book achieves the same status. I compared your book to that. And do you think that was a fair comparison, that it educates people about the history and current situation of the Inuit in Canada in a similar way to Chief Robert Joseph did in his book?
I think, the beautiful thing is when I begin to go back to that, MA thesis, is now I have the freedom to add much more.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Working under, academic
advisors,
that kind of stuff. So I did add in things like relocation, the facial, like Inuit women tattooed their face.
Oh yeah, I want to talk about that in a minute.
And their thighs, but men never tattooed, and that was interrupted as well. There's been a resurgence of that kind of tattooing, but it was also banned. Drum dancing was banned. And when you talk about relocation, my Inuit are Padlai Inuit, so
Yes.
So we were just above the tree line in northern Manitoba originally, and
Okay.
we were relocated 5 times. And what that means is that a float plane would come in, and literally the people are lifted with the clothing that they're wearing, and that's it.
I just want to underscore that you said 5 times your
5
people relocated 5 times.
Yeah. But what Padlai kept doing is, see, we were also called the people from beyond, and
Oh,
people of the willow,
okay.
because lived in those areas where there was willow trees. And but Padlai kept walking home. And in that process of being flown far away, and then starting to walk back home, there was starvation and death. And that isn't highlighted enough at all in Canadian history. So it's I had this opportunity to bring together many things out that were happening at the same time as that disc system was going on and on and on.
Mhm, mhm.
So you have to really take a hard look at what does that do to people, what does that do to them. And the majority of the people I interviewed, they talked about how, I remember my mom taking my necklace out of the kitchen cupboard and telling me, you have to memorize this number. You have to.
Mm,
Think about that. Those children would have been about 4 years old. And they're being told, you have to know this because you're going to go to school, and you need that. This is important. This is a very, very important thing for you to know. And a lot of Inuit, did say to me, I had a disc number, but I never knew why. Like, why did we have them? And when you think about the progression of time, um, when you're in around 1965, and the system started in 1941, it just it's almost like it was a part of everyday life, but you don't really understand how come. You just know
yeah,
that
yeah,
your mother told you have
yeah,
to memorize this number.
yeah. Norma, let me zoom into the really personal for a few minutes, because your book is about your personal quest. Not only to find your number, but your mother, you didn't know about your Inuit identity until you were an adult.
Mhm.
And I'd like to hear a bit about the journey of finding out about your identity, and then your amazing determination to get to the heart of the issue and get all the information you possibly could about it, and which you have, and now you've shared that with the world. But I just like to hear about your journey and how it's impacted you and how it's impacted your family. And just a little, I'm going to complicate the question. As a fiction author, you always learn that if your character isn't having hard enough time already, throw them an extra
That's right.
whammy. So I'm just going to complicate that question a little bit more and say, and on top of that, how has your notoriety as an Inuit author impacted your life and that of your family? So your
Well,
journey, and then how this recent success is impacting you.
well, for me, when the opening pages of my book talk about, I was about 8 years old when I'm at the playground and all the kids are talking about what they are. I'm
Yeah, quite
I'm
common.
this, I'm that, and like, what are you? And I'm like, I don't know, and they laugh at me. So that I walk home, and there's mom, and I ask her, what are we? What are we? And I remember, like, she said, like, who wants to know? And Darrel, when you're a mom and this finger is
Yeah,
pointing at
my
you,
mom used to do that too.
I know, it's like really serious. And boy, you better be paying attention. And and she's like, who wants to know? And I said, well, I was at the playground and everybody was saying what they were. And then they asked me, and I said, I don't know. And she says, well, you were born in Quebec. Now I'm number 5 of 6 children.
Okay.
And my father had rejoined the military, and my folks left the North just before I was born. So I was born in Quebec, but my two older brothers, two older sisters were born in Churchill. And my folks had, probably the first 10 years of their marriage was in Churchill, Manitoba.
Okay.
And they leave, but also at that time, my oldest sister and oldest brother are in day school. And my mother had survived 8 full years in a residential school in just outside of Winnipeg. And so when you think about it, when you think about what she went through, and now your children are being put into that same type of system, there's a reason why people leave. You leave. So my father had rejoined the military, and our first posting was in northern Quebec, and that's where I'm born. So my mom says to me, well, Norma, you were born in Quebec, so you tell people you're French. And so I did. I mean, my last name is Dunning. But I still told, hey, where do you? Well, I'm French. So, but that goes along until I'm about 16. And, my auntie, we had 1 year where my dad was stationed in Winnipeg, but he was away that full year. He had a project in Kinauvit. So it was just mom and my younger brother and myself. But my auntie used to come in, and she's the one, how aunties are.
Bless the aunties, eh? Yeah.
Yeah, aunties tell everybody all the dirt, like they really do. So she's the one who would talk about, the growing up and, what they were. And my mother would always be like, shh, shh, you don't talk about that. You don't talk about that. But you have to too, like for me, my oldest sister and brother, they have recollections of my mother speaking to them in Inuit.
Oh, wow. That's
But
amazing.
when we move away, she doesn't speak it anymore.
Oh.
She's fluent in French and English, and that's a result of residential school. And then, you start to think about how Indigenous people in Canada are treated. So, especially in that time frame. And so to me, it was like a form of protection to not talk about what we were. But inside that something isn't right. It just isn't fitting. Yeah. And so, when I make that application, I had an awareness of the system. I didn't really know, how it came into existence or, some intricacies about it. And when I'm asked, what was your disc number? I knew what that worker was speaking about. And that's when, Darrel, that's when I really start to pay attention to disc lists, because all of that information were kept on lists for each community.
Sure.
And I try to access them, but they're very difficult, very, very difficult to get information on. And in my head, it was like, if I can find one of my grandmothers, my grandfather had 3 wives, and that was not uncommon. And any women also would have more than one husband. That was not uncommon either. So I knew one of my grandmother's names. And so I look for her. And I start trying to find disc lists. And it's kind of because sometimes disc is spelt with a K, sometimes it's spelled with a K. And so when you're trying to do that kind of research, you're always having to double check all the time. And then I don't know, like it was, that application and receiving enrollment with Nunavut, that was very important to me. It was very, very important, and very important for my sons, to be able to have their beneficiary card. And
Norma, sorry, was your mother still alive when you got that information and your identity? No? Oh, okay.
and but for me, when I started to have grandchildren, I always wrote. I never published. And to me, it wasn't about publishing. It was about
Right.
writing. That's what mattered to me, was right. And you know, like Darrel, if you're ever here in my apartment, I have this box in my office and it's just filled with writing and writing and writing. But
Yeah.
and I just, you know, I wasn't all about, oh, I have to publish. I have to, you know,
Okay.
do something like that, until I started to have grandkids. And I wanted them to know their story through my story. And
Right.
and to me, that's when it really started to become important, because I know what it's like to grow up and think, well, what am I? Am I really French?
Yeah, right.
But
Yeah.
so that's what the real motivation to publish. And I never expected the response that I have received. I never expected to be awarded anything. And I'm always amazed if I am. So it's been beautiful, and I'm really grateful to the people who
Yeah.
support my work. I'm very thankful.
Well, and it's, I think it's time because, we've seen, I mean, there's still, I believe, so much ignorance about Inuit people within Canada and internationally. I mean, there's been so much exoticism, and how the Inuit have been portrayed as, I don't know what people feel about the use of the word Eskimo now, but, there's so much exoticism around the culture of what people used to know as Eskimos. And, but very little known. But there has been amazing emergence, in the film industry. I remember one of the most memorable films, and I'm not going to say the name correctly. If you can say it correctly, help me. But it's Atanajua, something like that. And that must have been in the 90s or in
no, Fast Runner
the year
is,
2000, after the year 2000.
yeah.
But that film left me just left me so, it was so memorable, it left me in tears. I was marveled at the beauty of the work.
Mhm.
And, in the field of music, of course, we have Susan Glukark, and the people around the world know about throat singing.
Mhm.
And we have, of course, our Governor General, the Right Honorable Mary Simon,
That's
who you
right.
mentioned too. And I mean, I had the good fortune of meeting Mary Simon a few months ago, and you can't find a more gracious person and a more deserving person for that role. So it's time that we've seen what some people call a resurgence or a renaissance of Indigenous voices in literature, and so I think it's time that our Inuit brothers and sisters, cousins, aunties, uncles, grandparents are joining the rest of the Indigenous wave. And I call it a revolution, of Indigenous voices. So, I'm on a bit of a soapbox here, and I apologize for that, but it's time. It's time for that kind of recognition. And I'm hoping that you're an inspiration to more Indigenous writers who will come forward, Inuit writers who will come forward.
Like Darrel, we really have to talk about this too. When it comes to being an Indigenous writer,
Yeah,
we're very much put into a box. And
right.
for Inuit, if you write something that's autobiographical or a legend, that then like publishers will take that up right away.
Okay.
And if you're writing outside of that, it's harder to find that publisher who will take that chance with your work. And I've been very fortunate, like with Eskimo Pie. That book has translated from English to French to Greek. Like, is that
Lovely. Wow.
amazing? And with with Annie Muktuk. It's English to French, and
Oh dear.
translation, and so wonderfully well. And with Diana, she transferred from, or translated from, English French to North Macedonian. And so I always think, I'm just, here my books are walking around the world in a different language, and I'm
Yeah.
proud of them.
Well, I should tell our guests that we have time for questions.
Sure.
And and I welcome them, but I'm just going to keep asking questions until some crop up, because I've been looking forward to this conversation so much. And there are similarities. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of differences between what we've called First Nations, whether that's First Nations who are classified as First Nations should all be put under the same rubric or not is another question. Like the west coast of Canada, the west coast of Vancouver Island, to me, they're very distinct people. The Cree people I'm from are very distinct people. We're very related to the Anishinaabe people and further, Algonquin speaking peoples, and the Dene kind of run north-south. But, there's this uniqueness that the Inuit have of this, which I'm so envious of, the circumpolar connection. And I'm curious and really wonder if there's been any uptake, and I wonder if there'll be any uptake of Inuit people in other parts of, like, the circumpolar region. Do you have any insight into that at all, or?
Oh, not really. Like there is still the circumpolar group has still existing. And it was through them that Canada stopped using the word Eskimo, and they fought for and got Inuit to become the mainstream word used.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what they're up to now. I know they're still in existence, Darrel.
Yeah. So we have a question from Katie Waterhouse. I'm interested by how the disc system as a colonial system of marking identity remains the easiest way to confirm that identity within by Inuit. Do you see that shifting and other Inuit systems of claiming and confirming identity coming to the forefront? So is there a more modern form of identity, I guess, for benefits, I guess? I mean,
like you said, the word Renaissance earlier, and there's been that renaissance of Inuit names, and that return to what were traditional names. And when we think about that naming system, it was based on whoever had passed away recently, the next child born was given that name. But not only that name, but that person's skills. So if a great male hunter had passed away and the next child is a girl, she would receive his name, and the expectation would be that she would become a great hunter. So, in that process, once the person who's passed away, once they have died, their soul, or we call it their turnik, would wander the tundra until a child received their name, and then then that soul would be at rest. And so there's that connection of life to death and death to life. And that was very, very important, in our ways of thinking and in our cosmology and all of that. So I will say a part of that answer is, there is that resurgence of returning to Inuit names, and it's good to see it. It's good to see it coming. It is.
Yeah, and for part of Canada, there's the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement. It doesn't include all Inuit, but you're a part of that. Your community is part of that, and so as part of the Land Claim Agreement, the the Inuit, the land claim agreement administrators and leaders are the ones who have the right to determine who is a member and who's Inuit and who isn't, right? And
It's narrow. It's more narrow than that, Darrell. It's
okay,
based on when I make application, that application goes out to Whale Cove. So there is no federal interference.
no, exactly. That's great.
Membership is brought in through the memory of the elders. So they
Wow.
remembered my mother and her father. And we have to remember, you know, like all of that information that our knowledge keepers hold, it's all oral and it's all memory, and it isn't written down. And so when somebody comes into training, they have to learn all of that. When they're an
Amazing.
elder training, they have to know all of that, those names and the family histories. So it's really
Mhm.
very beautiful. It's very beautiful.
It is. And I mean, the Nunavut, for those who don't know, it's worth learning about the model of the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement. I hold it up, you know, I'm often asked to speak as a former chief federal negotiator, asked to speak about and executive director of international relations for the Assembly First Nations. I'm often asked to give examples of positive developments in Canada, and the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement is certainly one that I hold high, because I think it gets as close to sovereignty as you can get, reclaiming sovereignty, and still be within a nation state like Canada. It's absolutely amazing.
I remember too, though, Darrell, that took 20 years. That land
Oh,
claim negotiated for
I
20,
know,
you know,
I
like
know. And for Nunavut to become its own territory is marvelous. That's
incredible.
with its own government, its own legislature,
Yeah,
and with Inuktitut as an official language, right?
right. But I mean, there was, you know, it's in Inuktitut in English, that land
Yeah,
claim. But along came
and in French, of course. Don't
uh,
forget.
But along came the federal government and said, oh, we need it in French as well. And that would have been something like $4 a word to have that translation made.
Absolutely.
So Nunavut said, no, we can't do that.
Really?
We don't have the money to do that. You want it in French, you do it in French.
Right.
All I know is that it became a closed door settlement. And so, you know, to have the government come back so many years later and say, oh yeah, you better be putting that in French as well, because English and French are our official languages. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
it's just it's really something.
I'm monopolizing your time here. There's another question. I learned so much from Ariel. I learned so much from Kinauvit. Thank you so much for writing it, Norma. My question is, do you have any tips for others who are searching for Inuit relatives or ancestry? And related, if you had to search for your mom's disc number, it's your grandmother's disc number actually, again, would you do anything differently?
No, you know, the problem is this, Ariel, is that the disc lists that are currently available are so heavily redacted. So what you will have
Oh,
is
really?
a column with the number, and then the next column is, you know, markered out, black marked out where the name is. Then you'll have the location that is visible, and then position in household, whether it's mom, dad, or child, that is redacted out. And then date of birth, that's there. So basically, the way the lists are currently being presented is so much of it has been redacted. And there is one group that did publish their lists online, and I don't know how they got away with it, but they've done it. And for me, like, I can find bits and pieces through other books. So Frank Tester and Peter Kolchinsky, they've written a couple of books concerning the Nunavut Lands Claim Agreement. And what rights, what actual hunting rights, have actually been issued. And so they will, they made mention of the discs, and then in the U of C, I managed to get a hold of a group of letters that were written by people out of Whale Cove, and they're writing to the federal government in around the early 70s, and they're asking for more heating oil through the winter to keep their houses warm. But in each of those letters, they sign with their name and their disc number. And so, so you have to look in untraditional manners of research to be able to find that kind of information, and it's very difficult. It is.
Well, I'm glad you had the success you did, Norma. That's amazing. And how about your children and grandchildren? How are they feeling about their identity and their situation, and having a grandmother who's so successful and
they
having
don't get, no, like Darrel, honestly, my youngest son is 34. He reads my books. My
okay.
two sons, no. And so I'm giving them books. Isn't that terrible of their mother? And I say to them, you never read them, so I'm going to keep them. But but they, they recognize, that it's hard work, and I think they're respectful that way. But I don't know what the next generation is like. They don't, how do I say it? They don't hang on to, like family history the way I did. That. And one of the courses that I teach, I have the students do a decolonized autobiography. And so they have to look into their family history. And, Darrel, so many of them come back and thank me because, well, in coming up, we never talked about grandma and grandpa or great grandma and grandpa. And I had to sit with my grandma and she told me. And so I think in this time, that the generations now I don't know if they don't have a lack of interest, or they just don't have they don't place the value, that we did. So
yeah, sometimes with as people mature, they gain interest in those things too. Right. So who knows where that's going to lead. But we don't have a lot of time left, Norma, but I'm really curious about, so I mean, I shouldn't even be asking this question with just this breaking news today of you being a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Writers Trust Prize for nonfiction. But what are you working on now? What are you up to now, and what's on the go?
I'm having so much fun. Well, I have two novels. Like you can write one or two, so I'm writing two. And one is, I call it my fun one, is one of them, and the other one is quite serious. So it's it's always really hard to designate time. Like, I'm just going to write. Like today,
right. Are you still teaching a lot? Are you teaching full time, or?
I teach, yes, I still teach.
Okay.
And I write for a cancer project, a cancer prevention project.
Oh, wow.
With Alberta First Nations and Métis communities. So there's always something, there's always something.
Mm-hmm. And what's your process for, well, I'm really intrigued by your writing. And I did read earlier, I think in preparation for a different interview we did about your academic background, but was a lot of your studies in creative writing, and are you called upon from time to time as a writing expert?
My BA was a Native Studies major and a minor in creative writing.
Okay.
And when I was doing my master's, I did take up higher levels of poetry and 500 levels of poetry and prose writing. I don't think it made me a better writer. I think it made me write, like that's
Okay.
different, that because then you're writing for a mark, and to be
Mhm.
able to pass the course. And and it's really, you're producing every week, a huge
Yeah.
amount of work every week. But is it really your best stuff? No, I don't think so. You don't have the time with it that you should, that. So, writing gets done when it gets done, Darrel.
Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled with the work you've been doing, and I think people should be approaching you as an expert writer as well, because I mean your work just draws me in. The rhythm of your prose and the descriptions are just fantastic. So I think, but on that note, I think our time is just about up, and it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Norma. And I hope to do a road trip back home to my territory this summer, and you're certainly on my list, and hope to have a person-to-person visit with you and catch up. Yeah,
Darrel.
yeah. Thank you from my heart. This was just such a wonderful visit.
Thank you for being always a good interviewer, and thank you for everybody who came out tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And for people who will be watching this into the future.
Yes, and thank you both.